Chapter 38. A Struggle. When our time came for returning to Bleak House again, we were punctual to the day, and were received with an overpowering welcome. I was perfectly restored to health and strength, and finding my housekeeping keys laid ready for me in my room, rang myself in as if I had been a new year, with a merry little peal. Once more, duty, duty, Esther, said I. And if you're not overjoyed to do it more than cheerfully and contentedly through anything and everything, you ought to be. That's all I have to say to you, my dear. The first few mornings were mornings of so much bustle and business, devoted to such settlements of accounts, such as repeated journeys to and fro between the growlery and all the other parts of the house, so many rearrangements of drawers and presses, and such a general new beginning altogether, that I had not a moment's leisure. But when these arrangements were completed and everything was in order, I paid a visit of a few hours to London, which something in the letter I had destroyed at Chesney Wold had induced me to decide upon in my own mind. I made Caddy Jellyby, her maiden name was so natural to me that I always called her by it, the pretext for this visit, and wrote her a note previously asking the favour of her company on a little business expedition. Leaving home very early in the morning, I got to London by stage-coach in such good time that I got to Newman Street with the day before me. Caddy, who had not seen me since her wedding day, was so glad and so affectionate that I was half inclined to fear I should make her husband jealous. But he was, in his way, just as bad, I mean as good, and in short it was the old story, and nobody would leave me any possibility of doing anything meritorious. The elder Mr. Turveydrop was in bed. I found Caddy, and Caddy was milling his chocolate, which a melancholy little boy who was an apprentice, it seemed such a curious thing to be apprenticed to the trade of dancing, was waiting to carry upstairs. Her father-in-law was extremely kind and considerate, Caddy told me, and they lived most happily together. When she spoke of their living together, she meant the old gentleman had all the good things and all the good lodging, while she and her husband had what they could get, and were poked into two corner rooms over the mews. "And how's your mamma, Caddy?" said I. "Why, I hear of her, Esther," replied Caddy, "though through Pa, but I see very little of her. We're good friends, I'm glad to say, but Ma thinks there's something absurd in having married a dancing master, and she is rather afraid of its extending to her." It struck me that if Mrs. Jellyby had discharged her own natural duties and obligations before she swept the horizon with a telescope in search of others, she would have taken the best precautions against becoming absurd. But I need scarcely observe that I kept this to myself. "And your papa, Caddy?" "He comes here every evening," returned Caddy, "and is so fond of sitting in the corner there that it's a treat to see him." Looking at the corner, I plainly perceived the mark of Mr. Jellyby's head against the wall. It was consolatory to know that he had found such a resting place for it. "And you, Caddy," said I, "you're always busy, I'll be bound." "Well, my dear," returned Caddy, "I am indeed, for to tell you a grand secret, I am qualifying myself to give lessons. Prince's health is not strong, and I want to be able to assist him, what with schools and classes here, and private pupils, and the apprentices. He really has too much to do, poor fellow." The notion of apprentices was still so odd to me that I asked Caddy if there were many of them. "4," said Caddy, "1 indoor and 3 out. They're all very good children, only when they get together they will play, children-like, instead of attending to their work. So the little boy you saw just now waltzes by himself in the empty kitchen, and we distribute the others over the house as well as we can." "That is only for their steps, of course," said I. "Only for their steps," said Caddy. "In that way they practise so many hours at a time, whatever steps they happen to be upon. They dance in the academy, and at this time of year we do figures at 5 every morning." "Why, what a laborious life!" I exclaimed. "I assure you, my dear," returned Caddy, smiling, "when the out-of-door apprentices ring us up in the morning, the bell rings into our room, not to disturb old Mr. Turveydrop, and when I put up the window and see them standing on the doorstep with their little pumps under their arms, I'm actually reminded of the sweeps." All this presented the art to me in a singular light, to be sure. Caddy enjoyed the effect of her communication, and cheerfully recounted the particulars of her own studies. You see, my dear, to save expense, I ought to know something of the piano, and I ought to know something of the kit too, and consequently I have to practise those two instruments as well as the details of our profession. If Ma had been like anybody else, I might have had some little musical knowledge to begin upon. However, I hadn't any, and that part of the work at first a little discouraging, I must allow. But I have a very good ear, and I'm used to drudgery. I have to thank Ma for that, at all events. And where there's a will, there's a way, you know, Esther, the world over. Saying these words, Caddy laughingly sat down at a little jingling square piano, and really rattled off a quadrille with great spirit. Then she good humouredly and blushingly got up again, and while she still laughed herself, said, "Don't laugh at me, please, that's a dear girl." I would have sooner have cried, but I did neither. I encouraged her and praised her with all my heart, for I conscientiously believed, dancing master's wife though she was, and dancing mistress through her limited ambition she aspired to be, she had struck out a natural, wholesome, loving course of industry and perseverance that was quite as good as a mission. My dear Caddy, delighted. You can't think how you cheer me. I shall owe you don't know how much. What changes, Esther, even in my small world. You recollect that first night, when I was so unpolite and inky. Who would have thought then of my ever teaching people to dance, of all the other possibilities and impossibilities? Her husband, who had left us while we had this chat, now coming back preparatory to exercising the apprentices in the ballroom, Caddy informed me she was quite at my disposal. But it was not my time yet, I was glad to tell her, for I should have been vexed to take her away then. Therefore we three adjourned to the apprentices together, and I made one in the dance. The apprentices were the queerest little people. Besides the melancholy boy, who I had hoped had not been made so by waltzing alone in the empty kitchen, there were two other boys, and one dirty little limp girl in a gauzy dress, such a precocious little girl, with such a dowdy bonnet on, that too of a gauzy texture, who brought her sandalled shoes in an old threadbare velvet reticule. Such mean little boys when they were not dancing with string and marbles, and crampons in their pockets, and the most untidy legs and feet, and heels particularly. I asked Caddy what had made their parents choose this profession for them. Caddy said she didn't know. Perhaps they were designed for teachers, perhaps for the stage. They were all people in humble circumstances, and the melancholy boy's mother kept a ginger beer shop. We danced for an hour with great gravity, the melancholy child doing wonders with his lower extremities, in which there appeared to be some sense of enjoyment, though it never rose above his waist. Caddy, while she was observant of her husband, and was evidently founded upon him, had acquired a grace and self-possession of her own, which, united to her pretty face and figure, was uncommonly agreeable. She already relieved him of much of the instruction of these young people, and he seldom interfered except to walk his part in the figure if he had anything to do in it. He always played the tune. The affectation of the gauzy child and her condescension to the boys was a slight, and thus we danced an hour by the clock. When the practice was concluded, Caddy's husband made himself ready to go out of town to a school, and Caddy ran away to go out with me. I sat in the ballroom in the interval contemplating the apprentices. The two outdoor boys went upon the staircase to put on their half boots and pull the indoor boy's hair, as I judged from the nature of his objections. Returning with their jackets buttoned and their pumps stuck in them, they then produced packets of cold bread and meat, and bivouacked under a painted lyre on the wall. The little gauzy child, having whisked her sandals into the reticule and put on a trodden-down pair of shoes, shook her head in the dowdy bonnet at one shake, and answering my inquiry whether she liked dancing, by replying, "Not with boys," tied it across her chin and went home contemptuous. "Old Mr. Turveydrop is so sorry," said Caddy, "that he has not finished dressing yet, and cannot have the pleasure of seeing you before you go. You are such a favourite of his, Esther." I expressed myself much obliged to him, but did not think it necessary to add that I readily dispensed with this attention. "It takes him a long time to dress," said Caddy, "because he is very much looked up to in such things, you know, and has a reputation to support. You can't think how kind he is to Pa. He talks to Pa of an evening about the Prince Regent, and I never saw Pa so interested. There was something in the picture of Mr. Turveydrop bestowing his deportment on Mr. Jellyby that quite took my fancy. I asked Caddy if he brought her papa out much. "No," said Caddy, "I don't know that he does that, but he talks to Pa, and Pa greatly admires him, and listens and likes it. Of course I am aware that Pa has hardly any claims to deportment, but they get on together delightfully. You can't think what good companions they make. I never saw Pa take snuff before in my life, but he takes one pinch out of Mr. Turveydrop's box regularly, and keeps putting it to his nose and taking it away again all the evening. That old Mr. Turveydrop should ever, in the chances and changes of life, have come to the rescue of Mr. Jellyby from Borrioboola appeared to me to be one of the pleasantest of oddities. As to Peepy, said Caddy, with a little hesitation, whom I was most afraid of next having any family of my own, Esther, even as an inconvenience to Mr. Turveydrop, the kindness of the old gentleman to that child is beyond everything. He asks to see him, my dear. He lets him take the newspaper up to him in bed, and gives him the crusts of his toast to eat. He sends him on little errands about the house. He tells him to come to me for sixpences. In short, said Caddy cheerily, and not to prose, I am a very fortunate girl, and ought to be very grateful. Where are we going, Esther? To the Old Street Road, said I, where I have a few words to say to the solicitor's clerk who was sent to meet me at the coach office on the very day when I came to London and first saw you, my dear. Now I think of it, the gentleman who brought us to your house. Then indeed I seem to be naturally the person to go with you, returned Caddy. To the Old Street Road we went, and there inquired at Mrs. Guppy's residence for Mrs. Guppy. Mrs. Guppy occupying the parlour, and having indeed been visibly in danger of cracking herself like a nut in the front parlour door by peeping out before she was asked for, immediately presented herself and requested us to walk in. She was an old lady in a large cap, with rather a red nose and rather an unsteady eye, but smiling all over. Her close little sitting-room was prepared for a visit, and there was a portrait of her son in it, which, I had almost written here, was more like than life. It insisted upon him with such obstinacy that it was so determined not to let him off. Not only was the portrait there, but we found the original there too. He was dressed in a great many colours, and was discovered at a table reading law papers with his forefinger to his forehead. "Miss Summerson," said Mr. Guppy, rising, "this is indeed an oasis. Mother, will you be so good as to put a chair for the other lady and get out of the gangway?" Mrs. Guppy, whose incessant smiling gave her quite a waggish appearance, did as her son requested, and then sat down in a corner, holding her pocket handkerchief to her chest like a fomentation with both hands. I presented Caddy, and Mr. Guppy said that any friend of mine was more than welcome. I then proceeded to the object of my visit. "I took the liberty of sending you a note, sir," said I. Mr. Guppy acknowledged the receipt by taking it out of his breast pocket, putting it to his lips, and returning it to his pocket with a bow. Mr. Guppy's mother was so diverted that she rolled her head as she smiled, made a silent appeal to Caddy with her elbow. "Could I speak to you alone for a moment?" said I. Anything like the jocosness of Mr. Guppy's mother just now I think I never saw. She made no sound of laughter, but she rolled her head and shook it, and put her handkerchief to her mouth, and appealed to Caddy with her elbow and her hand, and her shoulder, and was so unspeakably entertained altogether that it was with some difficulty she could marshal Caddy through the little folding door into her bedroom adjoining. "Miss Summerson," said Mr. Guppy, "you will excuse the waywardness of a parent ever mindful of her son's happiness. My mother, though highly exasperating to the feelings, is actuated by maternal dictates." I could hardly have believed that anybody could in a moment have turned so red or changed so much as Mr. Guppy did when I now put up my veil. "I ask the favour of seeing you for a few moments here," said I, "in preference to calling at Mr. Kenge's, because remembering what you said on an occasion when you spoke to me in confidence, I feared I might otherwise cause you some embarrassment, Mr. Guppy." I caused him embarrassment enough as it was, I am sure. I never saw such a faltering, such confusion, such amazement and apprehension. "Miss Summerson," stammered Mr. Guppy, I beg your pardon, but in our profession we find it necessary to be explicit. You have referred to an occasion, miss, when I did myself the honour of making a declaration which Something seemed to rise in his throat that he could not possibly swallow. He put his hand there, coughed, made faces, tried again to swallow it, coughed again, made faces again, looked all round the room, and fluttered his papers. "A kind of giddy sensation has come upon me, miss," he explained, "which rather knocks me over. A little subject to this sort of thing. By George!" I gave him a little time to recover. He consumed it in putting his hand to his forehead and taking it away again, and backing his chair into the corner behind him. "My intention was to remark, miss," said Mr. Guppy, "dear me, something bronchial, I think, to remark that you were so good on that occasion as to repel and repudiate that declaration. You wouldn't perhaps object to admit that, though no witnesses are present. It might be a satisfaction to your mind if you was to put in that admission." "There can be no doubt," said I, "that I declined your proposal without any reservation or qualification whatever, Mr. Guppy." "Thank you, miss," he returned, measuring the table with his troubled hands. "So far that's satisfactory, and it does you credit. This is certainly bronchial, must be in the tubes. You wouldn't perhaps be offended if I was to mention, not that it's necessary, for your own good sense or any person's sense must show 'em, that if I was to mention that such a declaration on my part was final and there terminated." "I quite understand that," said I. "Perhaps it might not be worth the form, but it might be a satisfaction to your mind. Perhaps you wouldn't object to admit that, miss," said Mr. Guppy. "I admit it most fully and freely," said I. "Thank you," returned Mr. Guppy. "Very honourable, I'm sure. I regret that my arrangements in life, combined with the circumstances over which I have no control, will put it out of my power ever to fall back upon that offer or renew it in any shape or form whatever. But it will be ever retrospect entwined with friendship's bowers." Mr. Guppy's bronchitis came to his relief, and stopped his measurement of the table. "I may now perhaps mention what I wish to say to you," I began. "I shall be honoured, I'm sure," said Mr. Guppy. "I'm so persuaded that your own good sense and right feeling, miss, will keep you as square as possible, that I can have nothing but pleasure, I am sure, in hearing any observations you may wish to offer." "You were so good as to imply on that occasion—" "Excuse me, miss," said Mr. Guppy, "but we had better not travel out of the record into implication. I cannot admit that I implied anything." "You said on that occasion," I recommenced, "that you might possibly have the means of advancing my interests and promoting my fortunes by making discoveries of which I should be the subject. I presume that you founded that belief upon your general knowledge of my being an orphan girl, indebted for everything to the benevolence of Mr. Jarndyce. Now, the beginning and the end of what I have come to beg of you is, Mr. Guppy, you have the kindness to relinquish all idea of so serving me. I have thought of this sometimes, and I have thought of it most lately, since I have been ill. At length I have decided, in case you should at any time recall that purpose and act upon it in any way, to come to you and assure you that you are altogether mistaken. You can make no discovery in reference to me that would do me the least service or give me the least pleasure. I am acquainted with my personal history, and I have it in my power to assure you that you can never advance my welfare by such means. You may perhaps have abandoned this project a long time. If so, excuse my giving you unnecessary trouble. If not, I entreat you, on the assurance I have given you, henceforth to lay it aside. I beg you to do this for my peace." "I'm bound to confess," said Mr. Guppy, "that you express yourself, miss, with that good sense and right feeling for which I gave you credit. Nothing can be more satisfactory than such right feeling, and if I mistook any intentions on your part just now, I am prepared to tender a full apology. I should wish to be understood, miss, as hereby offering that apology, limiting it, as your own good sense and right feeling will point out the necessity of, to the present proceedings." I must say for Mr. Guppy that the snuffling manner he had upon him improved very much. He seemed truly glad to be able to do something I asked, and he looked ashamed. "If you will allow me to finish what I have to say at once, so that I may have no occasion to resume," I went on, seeing him about to speak, "you'll do me a kindness, sir. I come to you as privately as possible, because you announced this impression of yours to me in a confidence which I have really wished to respect, which I always have respected, as you remember. I have mentioned my illness, There really is no reason why I should hesitate to say that I know very well that any little delicacy I may have had in making a request to you is quite removed. Therefore I make the entreaty I have now preferred, and I hope you will have sufficient consideration for me to accede to it." I must do Mr. Guppy the further justice of saying that he looked more and more ashamed, and that he looked most ashamed and very earnest when he now replied, with a burning face, "'Pon my word and honour, 'pon my life, 'pon my soul, Miss Summerson, as I am a living man, I'll act according to your wish. I'll never go another step of opposition to it. I'll take my oath to it, if it will be any satisfaction to you, in what I promise at this present time touching the matters now in question," continued Mr. Guppy rapidly, as if he were repeating a familiar form of words. "I'll speak the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So—" "I am quite satisfied," said I, rising at this point, "and I thank you very much. Caddy, my dear, I am ready." Mr. Guppy's mother returned with Caddy, now making me the recipient of her silent laughter and her nudges, and we took our leave. Mr. Guppy saw us to the door with the air of one who was either imperfectly awake or walking in his sleep, and we left him there staring. But in a minute he came after us down the street without any hat, with his long hair all blown about, and stopped us, saying fervently, "Miss Summerson, upon my honour and soul, you may depend upon me." "I do," said I, quite confidently. "Beg your pardon, miss," said Mr. Guppy, going with one leg and staying with the other, "but this lady being present, your own witness, it might be a satisfaction to your mind, which I should wish to set at rest, if you was to repeat those admissions." "Well, Caddy," said I, turning to her, "perhaps you will not be surprised when I tell you, my dear, that there never has been any engagement, nor proposal or promise of marriage whatsoever," suggested Mr. Guppy. "No proposal or promise of marriage whatsoever," said I, "between this gentleman—" "William Guppy, of Penton Place, Pentonville, in the county of Middlesex," he murmured. "Between this gentleman, Mr. William Guppy, of Penton Place, Pentonville, in the county of Middlesex, and myself." "Thank you, miss," said Mr. Guppy. "Very full, excuse me, lady's name, Christian and surname both." I gave them. "Thank you. Formerly Caroline Jellyby, spinster then, of Favy's Inn, within the City of London, but extra parochial, now of Newman Street, Oxford Street. Much obliged." He ran home and came running back again. "Touching that matter, you know, I really and truly am sorry for my arrangements in life, combined with circumstances over which I have no control, should prevent the renewal of what was wholly terminated some time back," said Mr. Guppy to me, forlornly and despondently. "But it couldn't be, now could it? You know I only put it to you." I replied, it certainly could not. The subject did not admit of a doubt. He thanked me and ran to his mother's again, and back again. "It's very honourable of you, miss, I'm sure," said Mr. Guppy, "if an altar could be erected in the bowers of friendship, but, upon my soul, you may rely upon me in every respect, save and except the tender passion only." The struggle in Mr. Guppy's breast, and the numerous oscillations it occasioned him between his mother's door and us, were sufficiently conspicuous in the windy street, particularly as his hair wanted cutting, to make us hurry away. I did so with a lightened heart, for when we last looked back, Mr. Guppy was still oscillating in the same troubled state of mind. Chapter 39. Attorney and Client. The name of Mr. Vholes, preceded by the legend "Ground Floor," is inscribed upon a doorpost in Symonds Inn, Chancery Lane, a little pale, wall-eyed, woe-begone inn, like a large dustbin of 2 compartments and a sifter. It looks as if Simon were a sparing man in his way, and constructed his inn of old building materials, which took kindly to the dry rot and to dirt and all things decaying and dismal, and perpetuated Simon's memory with congenial shabbiness. Quartered in this dingy hatchment commemorative of Simon are the legal bearings of Mr. Vholes. Mr. Vholes's office, in disposition retiring and in situation retired, is squeezed up in a corner and blinks at a dead wall. 3 feet of knotty floored dark passage bring the client to Mr. Vholes's jet black door, in an angle profoundly dark on the brightest midsummer morning, and encumbered by a black bulkhead of cellarage staircase, against which belated civilians generally strike their brows. Mr. Vholes's chambers are on so small a scale that one clerk can open the door without getting off his stool, while the other who follows him at the same desk has equal facilities for poking the fire. The smell, as of unwholesome sheep, blending with the smell of must and dust, is referable to the nightly and often daily consumption of mutton fat in candles, and to the fretting parchment forms and skins in greasy drawers. The atmosphere is otherwise stale and close. The place was last painted or whitewashed beyond the memory of man, and the two chimneys smoke, and there is a loose outer surface of soot everywhere, and the dull cracked windows in their heavy frames have but one piece of character in them, which is a determination to be always dirty and always shut unless coerced. This accounts for the phenomenon of the weaker of the two usually having a bundle of firewood thrust between its jaws in hot weather. Mr. Vholes is a very respectable man. He is not a large business, but he is a very respectable man. He is allowed by the greater attorneys who have made good fortunes, or are making them, to be a most respectable man. He never misses a chance in his practice, which is a mark of respectability. He never takes any pleasure, which is another mark of respectability. He is reserved and serious, which is another mark of respectability. His digestion is impaired, which is highly respectable, and he is making hay of the grass which is flesh for his 3 daughters, and his father is dependent upon him in the Vale of Taunton. The one great principle of the English law is to make business for itself. There is no other principle distinctly, certainly, and consistently maintained through all its narrow turnings. Viewed by this light, it becomes a coherent scheme, and not the monstrous maze the laity are apt to think it. Let them but once clearly perceive that its grand principle is to make business for itself at their expense, and surely they will cease to grumble. But not perceiving this quite plainly, only seeing it by halves in a confused way, the laity sometimes suffer in peace and pocket with bad grace, and do grumble very much. And this respectability of Mr. Vholes is brought into powerful play against them. "Repeal this statute, my good sir," says Mr. Kench to a smarting client. "Repeal it, my dear sir? Never, with my consent. After this law, sir, and what will be the effect of your rash proceeding on a class of practitioners very worthy represented, allow me to say to you, by the opposite attorney in the case, Mr. Vholes, sir, that a class of practitioners would be swept from the face of the earth. Now you cannot afford, I will pay, the social system cannot afford, to lose an order of men like Mr. Vholes, diligent, persevering, steady, acute in business. My dear sir, I understand your present feelings against the existing state of things, which I grant to be a little hard in your case. But I can never raise my voice for the demolition of a class of men like Mr. Vholes. The respectability of Mr. Vholes has even been cited with crushing effect before parliamentary committees, as in the following blue minutes of a distinguished attorney's evidence. Question number 517,869. If I understand you, these forms of practice indisputably occasion delay. Answer, yes, some delay. Question, and at great expense. Answer, most assuredly, they cannot be gone through for nothing. Question, and an unspeakable vexation. Answer, I'm not prepared to say that. They've never given me any vexation. Quite the contrary. Question, but do you think that their abolition would damage a class of practitioners? Answer, I have no doubt of it. Question, can you instance any type of that class? Answer, yes, I would unhesitatingly mention Mr. Vholes. He would be ruined. Question, Mr. Vholes is considered in the profession a respectable man. Answer, which proved fatal to the inquiry for 10 years. Mr. Vholes is considered in the profession a most respectable man. So in familiar conversation, private authority, no less disinterested, will remark that they don't know what this age is coming to, and that we are plunging down precipices, that now here is something else gone, that all these changes are death to people like Vholes, a man of undoubted respectability, with a father in the Vale of Taunton and 3 daughters at home. Take a few steps more in this direction, they say, and what is to become of Vholes's father? Is he to perish? And of Vholes's daughters, are they to be shirt makers or governesses? As though Mr. Vholes and his relations, being minor cannibal chiefs, and it is proposed to abolish cannibalism, indignant champions were put to the case thus: make man-eating unlawful, and you starve the Vholeses. In a word, Mr. Vholes, with his 3 daughters and his father in the Vale of Taunton, is continually doing duty like a piece of timber to shore up some decayed foundation that has become a pitfall and a nuisance. And with a great many people in a great many instances, the question is never one of a change from wrong to right, which is quite an extraneous consideration, but is always one of injury or advantage to the eminently respectable legion, Vholes. The Chancellor is, within these 10 minutes, up for the long vacation. Mr. Vholes and his young client, and several blue bags hastily stuffed out of all regularity of form, as the larger sort of serpents are in their first gorged state, have returned to the official den. Mr. Vholes, quiet and unmoved, as a man of so much respectability ought to be, takes off his close black gloves as if he were skinning his hands, lifts off his tight hat as if he were scalping himself, and sits down at his desk. The client throws his hat and gloves upon the ground, tosses them anywhere without looking after them or caring where they go, flings himself into a chair, half sighing, half groaning, rests his aching head upon his hand, and looks the portrait of young despair. Again, nothing done, says Richard. Nothing done. Can't say nothing done, sir, returns the placid Vholes. That is scarcely fair, sir, scarcely fair. Why, what is done? Says Richard, turning gloomily upon him. That may not be the whole question, returns Vholes. The question may branch off into what is doing, what is doing. And what is doing? Asks the moody client. Vholes, sitting with his arms on the desk, quietly bringing the tips of his 5 right fingers to meet the tips of his 5 left fingers, and quietly separating them again, and fixedly, slowly looking at his client, replies, "A good deal is doing, sir. We have put our shoulders to the wheel, Mr. Carstone, and the wheel is going round." "Yes, with Ixion on it. How am I to get through the next 4 or 5 accursed months?" exclaims the young man, rising from his chair and walking about the room. "Mr. C," returns Vholes, following him close with his eyes wherever he goes, "your spirits are hasty, and I am sorry for it on your account. Excuse me if I recommend you do not chafe so much, not to be so impetuous, not to wear yourself out. You should have more patience. You should sustain yourself better." "I ought to imitate you, in fact, Mr. Vholes," says Richard, sitting down again with an impatient laugh, and beating the devil's tattoo with his boot on the patternless carpet. "Sir," returns Vholes, always looking at the client as if he were making a lingering meal of him, with his eyes as well as with his professional appetite. "Sir," returns Vholes, with his inward manner of speech and his bloodless quietude, "I should not have the presumption to propose myself as a model for your imitation, or any man's. Let me but leave the good name to my 3 daughters, and that's enough for me. I'm not a self-seeker, and since you mention me so pointedly, I will acknowledge that I should like to impart to you a little of my— come, sir, you are disposed to call it insensibility. I am sure I have no objection. Say insensibility, a little of my insensibility." "Mr. Vholes," explains the client, somewhat abashed, "I had no intention to accuse you of insensibility." "I think you had, sir, without knowing it," returns the equable Vholes. "Very naturally, it's my duty to attend your interests with a cool head, and I can quite understand that to your excited feelings I may appear at such times as the present insensible. My daughters may know me better, my aged father may know me better. They have known me much longer than you have, and the confiding eye of affection is not the distrustful eye of business. Not that I complain, sir, of the eye of business being distrustful. Quite the contrary. In attending to your interests, I wish to have all possible checks upon me. It is right that I should have them. I court inquiry, but your interests demand that I should be cool and methodical, Mr. Carstone, and I cannot be otherwise. No, sir, not even to please you." Mr. Vholes, after glancing at the official cat, who is patiently watching a mouse's hole, fixes his charmed gaze again on his young client, and proceeds in his buttoned-up, half-audible voice, as if there were an unclean spirit in him that will neither come out nor speak out. "What are you to do, sir? Do you inquire during the vacation? I should hope you gentlemen of the army may find many means of amusing yourself if you give your minds to it. If you had asked me what I was to do during the vacation, I could have answered you more readily. I am to attend to your interests. I am to be found here day by day, attending to your interests. That is my duty, Mr. C. Term time or vacation makes no difference to me. If you wish to consult me as to your interests, you will find me here at all times alike. Other professional men go out of town. I don't. Not that I blame them for going. I merely say I don't go. This desk is your rock, sir." Mr. Vholes gives it a rap, and it sounds as hollow as a coffin. Not to Richard, though. There is encouragement in the sound to him. Perhaps Mr. Vholes knows there is. "I am perfectly aware, Mr. Vholes," says Richard, more familiarly and good-humouredly, "that you are the most reliable fellow in the world, and that to have to do with you is to have to do with a man of business, who is not to be hoodwinked. But put yourself in my case, dragging on in this dislocated life, sinking deeper and deeper and deeper into difficulty every day, continually hoping and continually disappointed, conscious of change upon change for the worse in myself, and of no change for the better in anything else. And you will find it a dark-looking case sometimes, as I do. You know," says Mr. Vholes, "that I never give hopes, sir. I told you from the first, Mr. C., that I never give hopes, particularly in a case like this, where the greater part of the costs comes out of the estate. I should not be considerate of my good name if I gave hopes. It might seem as if costs were my object. Still, when you say there is no change for the better, I must, as a bare matter of fact, deny that." "Aye," returns Richard, brightening, "but how do you make it out?" "Mr. Carstone, you are represented by, you said just now, a rock." "Yes, sir," says Mr. Vholes, gently shaking his head and rapping the hollow desk with a sound as if ashes were falling on ashes and dust on dust. "A rock. That's something. You are separately represented, and no longer hidden and lost in the interests of others. That's something. The suit does not sleep. We wake it up. We air it. We walk it about. That's something. It's not all Jarndyce. In fact, as well as in name, that's something. Nobody has it all his own way now, sir, and that's something, surely." Richard, his face flushing suddenly, strikes the desk with his clenched hand. "Mr. Vholes, if any man had told me when I first went to John Jarndyce's house that he was anything but a disinterested friend he seemed, that he was what he has gradually turned out to be, could have found no words strong enough to repel the slander. I could not have defended him too ardently, so little did I know of the world. Whereas now I do declare to you that he becomes to me the embodiment of the suit, that in place of its being an abstraction, it is John Jarndyce, that the more I suffer, the more indignant I am with him, that every new delay and every new disappointment is only a new injury from John Jarndyce's hand." "No, no," says Vholes, "don't say so. We ought to have patience, all of us. Besides, I never disparage, sir. I never disparage." "Mr. Vholes," returns the angry client, "you know as well as I that he would have strangled the suit if he could." "He was not active in it," Mr. Vholes admits with an appearance of reluctance. "He certainly was not active in it. But however, he might have had amiable intentions. Who can read the heart, Mr. C?" "You can," returns Richard. I, Mr. C, well enough to know what his intentions were. Are or are not our interests conflicting? Tell me that, says Richard, accompanying his last three words with three raps on his rock of trust. Mr. C, returns Vholes, immovable in attitude and never winking his hungry eyes. I should be wanting in my duty as your professional adviser. I should be departing from my fidelity to your interests if I represented those interests as identical with the interests of Mr. Jarndyce. They are no such thing, sir. I never impute motives. I both have and am a father, and I never impute motives. But I must not shrink from a professional duty, even if it sows dissensions in families. I understand you to be now consulting me professionally as to your interests. You are so? I reply, then, they are not identical with those of Mr. Jarndyce. Of course they're not, cries Richard. You found that out long ago. Mr. C, returns Vholes, I wish to say no more of any third party than is necessary. I wish to leave my good name unsullied, together with any little property of which I may become possessed through industry and perseverance, to my daughters Emma, Jane, and Caroline. I also desire to live in amity with my professional brethren. When Mr. Skimpole did me the honour, sir, I will not say the very high honour, for I never stoop to flattery, of bringing us together in this room, I mentioned to you that I could offer no opinion or advice as to your interests while those interests were entrusted to another member of the profession. I spoke in such terms as I was bound to speak of Kenge and Carboy's office, which stands high. You, sir, thought fit to withdraw your interests from that keeping nevertheless, and to offer them to me. You brought them with clean hands, sir, and I accept them with clean hands. Those interests are now paramount in this office. My digestive functions, as you may have heard me mention, are not in a good state, and rest might improve them. But I shall not rest so while I am your representative. Wherever you want me, you will find me here. Summon me anywhere, and I will come. During the long vacation, sir, I shall devote my leisure to studying your interests more and more closely, and to making arrangements for moving heaven and earth, including, of course, the Chancellor after Michaelmas term, when I ultimately congratulate you, sir, says Mr. Vholes, with the severity of a determined man, when I ultimately congratulate you, sir, with all my heart, on your accession to fortune, which, but that I never give hopes, I might say something further about. You will owe me nothing beyond whatever little balance may then be outstanding of the costs as between solicitor and client, not included in the tax costs allowed out of the estate. I pretend no claim upon you, Mr. C, but for the zealous and active discharge, not the languid and routine discharge, sir, that much credit I stipulate, of my professional duty. My duty prosperously ended, all between us is ended. Vholes finally adds, by way of rider to this declaration of his principles, that as Mr. Carstone is about to join his regiment, perhaps Mr. C will favour him with an order on his agent for £20 on account. For there have been many little consultations and attendances of late, sir, observes Vholes, turning over the leaves of his diary, and these things mount up, and I don't profess to be a man of capital. When we first entered on our present relations, I stated to you openly, it is a principle of mine that there can never be too much openness between solicitor and client, that I was not a man of capital, and that if capital was your object, you'd better leave your papers in Kenge's office. No, Mr. C, you will find none of the advantages or disadvantages of capital here, sir. This, Vholes gives the desk one hollow blow again, is your rock. It pretends to be nothing more. The client, with his dejection insensibly relieved, and his vague hopes rekindled, takes pen and ink and writes the draft, not without perplexed consideration and calculation of the date it may bear, implying scant effects in the agent's hands. All the while, Vholes, buttoned up in body and mind, looks at him attentively. All the while, Vholes' official cat watches the mouse's hole. Lastly, the client, shaking hands, beseeches Mr. Vholes for heaven's sake and earth's sake to do his utmost to pull him through the Court of Chancery. Mr. Vholes, who never gives hopes, lays his palm upon the client's shoulder and answers with a smile, "Always here, sir. Personally or by letter, you will always find me here, sir, with my shoulder to the wheel." Thus they part. Vholes, left alone, employs himself in carrying sundry little matters out of his diary into his draft bill book, for the ultimate behoof of his 3 daughters. So might an industrious fox or bear make up his account of chickens or stray travellers with an eye to his cubs. But not to disparage by that word the 3 raw-visaged, lank, and buttoned-up maidens who dwell with the parent Vholes in an earthy cottage situated in a damp garden at Kennington. Richard, emerging from the heavy shade of Symonds Inn into the sunshine of Chancery Lane, for there happens to be sunshine there to-day, walks thoughtfully on, and turns into Lincoln's Inn, passes under the shadow of the Lincoln's Inn trees. On many such loungers have the speckled shadows of those trees often fallen. On the light bent-in head, the bitten nail, the lowering eye, the lingering step, the purposeless and dreamy air, the good consuming and consumed, the life turned sour. This lounger is not shabby yet, but that may come. Chancery, which knows no wisdom but in precedent, is very rich in such precedents, and why should one be different from 10,000? Yet the time is so short since his depreciation began, that as he saunters away, reluctant to leave the spot for some long months together, though he hates it, Richard himself may feel his own case as if it were a startling one, while his heart is heavy with corroding care, suspense, distrust, and doubt. It may have room for some sorrowful wonder when he recalls how different his first visit there, how different he, how different all the colours of his mind. But injustice breeds injustice. The fighting with shadows and being defeated by them necessitates the setting up of substances to combat. From the impalpable sweet, which no man alive can understand, the time for that being long gone by, it has become a gloomy relief to turn the palpable figure of the friend who would have saved him from this ruin and made him his enemy. Richard has told Vholes the truth. Is he in a hardened or softened mood? He still lays his injuries equally at that door. He was thwarted in that quarter of set purpose, and that purpose could only originate in the one subject that is resolving his existence into itself. Besides, it is a justification to him in his own eyes to have an embodied antagonist and oppressor. Is Richard a monster in all this, or would Chancery be found rich in such precedents too, if they could be got for citation from the recording angel? 2 pairs of eyes, not unused to such people, look after him, as, biting his nails and brooding, he crosses the square and is swallowed up by the shadow of the southern gateway. Mr. Guppy and Mr. Weevil are the possessors of those eyes, and they have been leaning in conversation against the low stone parapet under the trees. He passes close by them, seeing nothing but the ground. "William," says Mr. Weevil, adjusting his whiskers, "there's combustion going on there. It's not a case of spontaneous, but it's smouldering combustion, it is." "Ah," says Mr. Guppy, "he wouldn't keep out of Jarndyce, and I suppose he's over his head and ears in debt. Never knew much of him. He was as high as the Monument when he was on trial at our place. A good riddance to me, whether as clerk or client. Well, Tony, that, as I was mentioning, is what they're up to." Mr. Guppy, refolding his arms, resettles himself against the parapet, as resuming a conversation of interest. "They are still up to it, sir," says Mr. Guppy. "Still taking stock, still examining papers, still going over the heaps and heaps of rubbish. At this rate they'll be at it these 7 years." "And is Small helping?" "Small left us at a week's notice. Told Kenge his grandfather's business was too much for the old gentleman, and he could do better himself by undertaking it. There'd been a coolness between myself and Small on account of his being so close, but he said you and I began it, and as he had me there, for we did, I put our acquaintance on the old footing. That's how I came to know what they're up to. You haven't looked in at all?" "Tony," says Mr. Guppy, a little disconcerted, "to be unreserved with you, I don't greatly relish the house except in your company, and therefore I propose this little appointment for fetching away your things." "There goes the hour by the clock, Tony." Mr. Guppy becomes mysteriously and tenderly eloquent. "It is necessary that I should impress upon your mind once more that circumstances over which I have no control have made a melancholy alteration in my most cherished plans, and in that unrequited image which I had formerly mentioned to you as a friend, that image is shattered, and that the idol is laid low. My only wish now, in connection with the objects which I had an idea of carrying out in the court with your aid as a friend, is to let them alone and bury them in oblivion. Do you think it possible? Do you think it at all likely, if I put it to you, Tony, as a friend, from your knowledge of that capricious and deep old character who fell a prey to the spontaneous element, do you, Tony, think it at all likely that on second thoughts he put those letters away anywhere after you saw him alive, and that they were not destroyed that night?" Mr. Weevil reflects for some time, shakes his head, decidedly thinks not. "Tony," says Mr. Guppy, as they walk towards the court, "once again understand me as a friend. Without entering into further explanations, I may repeat that the idol is down. I have no purpose to serve now but burial in oblivion. To that I have pledged myself. I owe it to myself, and I owe it to the shattered image, as also to the circumstances over which I have no control. If you was to express to me by a gesture, by a wink, that you saw lying anywhere in your late lodgings any papers that so much as looked like the papers in question, I would pitch them into the fire, sir, on my own responsibility." Mr. Weevil nods. Mr. Guppy, much elevated in his own opinion by having delivered these observations, with an air in part forensic and in part romantic, this gentleman having a passion for conducting anything in the form of an examination, or delivering anything in the form of a summing up or a speech, accompanies his friend with dignity to the court. Never since it has been a court has it had such a fortunatus purpose of gossip as in the proceedings at the rag and bottle shop. Regularly every morning at 8 is the elder Mr. Smallweed brought down to the corner and carried in, accompanied by Mrs. Smallweed, Judy, and Bard, and regularly all day do they all remain there until 9 at night, solaced by gipsy dinners, not abundant in quantity, from the cook's shop, rummaging and searching, digging and delving, and diving among the treasures of the late lamented. What those treasures are they keep so secret the court is maddened. In its delirium it imagines guineas pouring out of teapots, crown pieces overflowing punch bowls, old chairs and mattresses stuffed with Bank of England notes. It possesses itself of the sixpenny history, with highly coloured folding frontispiece, of Mr. Daniel Dancer and his sister, and also of Mr. Ulwes of Suffolk, and transfers all the facts from those authentic narratives to Mr. Crook. Twice, when the dustman is called to carry off a cartload of old paper, ashes, and broken bottles, the whole court assembles and pries into the baskets as they come forth. Many times the two gentlemen who write with the ravenous little pens on the tissue paper are seen prowling in the neighbourhood, shy of each other, their late partnership being dissolved. The soul skilfully carries out a vein of the prevailing interest through the harmonic nights. Little swills, in what are professionally known as patter allusions to the subject, is received with loud applause, and the same vocalist gags in the regular business like a man inspired. Even Miss M. Melvinson, in the revived Caledonian melody of "We're a Nodding," points the sentiment that the dogs love brew, whatever the nature of that refreshment may be, with such archness and such a turn of the head towards next door, that she is immediately understood to mean Mr. Smallweed loves to find money, and is nightly honoured with a double encore. For all this the court discovers nothing, and as Mrs. Piper and Mrs. Perkins now communicate to the late lodger, whose appearance is a signal for a general rally, it is in one continual ferment to discover everything and more. Mr. Weevil and Mr. Guppy, with every eye in the court's head upon them, knock at the closed door of the late lamented's house, in a high state of popularity, but being contrary to the court's expectation, admitted, they immediately become unpopular and considered to mean no good. The shutters are more or less closed all over the house, and the ground floor is sufficiently dark to require candles. Introduced into the back shop by Mr. Smallweed the younger, they, fresh from the sunlight, can at first see nothing save darkness and shadows, but they gradually discern the elder Mr. Smallweed seated in his chair upon the brink of a well or grave of waste paper, the virtuous Judy groping therein like a female sexton, and Mrs. Smallweed on the level ground in the vicinity, snowed up in a heap of paper fragments, print and manuscript, which would appear to be the accumulated compliments that have been sent flying at her in the course of the day. The whole party, Small included, are blackened with dust and dirt, and present a fiendish appearance, not relieved by the general aspect of the room. There is more litter and lumber in it than of old, and it is dirtier if possible. Likewise it is ghostly with traces of its dead inhabitant, and even with his chalked writing on the wall. On the entrance of visitors, Mr. Smallweed and Judy simultaneously fold their arms and stop in their researches. "Aha!" croaks the old gentleman. "How do you do, gentlemen? How do you do? Come to fetch your property, Mr. Weevil? That's well, that's well. We should have been forced to sell you up, sir, to pay your warehouse room if you'd left it here much longer. You feel quite at home again, I dare say. Glad to see you. Glad to see you." Mr. Weevil, thanking him, casts an eye about. Mr. Guppy's eyes follows Mr. Weevil's eye. Mr. Weevil's eye comes back without any new intelligence in it. Mr. Guppy's eye comes back and meets Mr. Smallweed's eye. That engaging old gentleman is still murmuring like some wound-up instrument running down. "How do you do, sir? How do you do? How?" And then, having run down, he lapses into grinning silence, as Mr. Guppy starts at seeing Mr. Tulkinghorn standing in the darkness opposite with his hands behind him. "Gentleman so kind to act as my solicitor," says Grandfather Smallweed. "I'm not the sort of client for a gentleman of such note, but he is so good." Mr. Guppy, slightly nudging his friend to take another look, makes a shuffling bow to Mr. Tulkinghorn, who returns it with an easy nod. Mr. Tulkinghorn is looking on as if he had nothing else to do, and were rather amused by the novelty. "Good deal of property here, sir, I should say," Mr. Guppy observes to Mr. Smallweed. "Principally rags and rubbish, my dear friend. Rags and rubbish. Me and Bart and my granddaughter Judy are endeavouring to make out an inventory of what's worth anything to sell. But we haven't come to much as yet. We haven't come to—" Mr. Smallweed has run down again, and while Mr. Weevil's eye, attended by Mr. Guppy's eye, has again gone round the room and come back. "Well, sir," says Mr. Weevil, "we won't intrude any longer if you allow us to go upstairs." "Anywhere, my dear sir, anywhere. You're at home. Make yourself so, pray." As they go upstairs, Mr. Guppy lifts his eyebrows inquiringly and looks at Tony. Tony shakes his head. They find the old room very dull and dismal, with the ashes of the fire that was burning on that memorable night yet in the discoloured grate. They have a great disinclination to touch any object, carefully blow the dust from it at first. Nor are they desirous to prolong their visit, packing the few movables with all possible speed, and never speaking above a whisper. "Look here," says Tony, recoiling. "Is that horrible cat coming in?" Mr. Guppy retreats behind a chair. "Small told me of her. She went leaping and bounding and tearing about that night like a dragon. Got out on the housetop and roamed about up there for a fortnight, and then came tumbling down the chimney very thin. Do you ever see such a brute? Looks as if she knew all about it, don't she? Almost looks as if she was crook. Shoo, go on, get out, you goblin." Lady Jane in the doorway, with her tiger snarl from ear to ear, and her club of a tail, shows no intention of obeying. But Mr. Tulkinghorn stumbling over her, she spits at his rusty legs, and swearing wrathfully takes her arch back upstairs, possibly to roam the housetops again and return by the chimney. "Mr. Guppy," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, "can I have a word with you?" Mr. Guppy is engaged in collecting the Galaxy Gallery of British Beauty from the wall, and depositing those works of art in their old ignoble bandbox. "Sir," he returns, reddening. I wish to act with courtesy towards every member of the profession, and especially, I am sure, towards a member of it so well known as yourself. I will truly add, sir, so distinguished as yourself. Still, Mr. Tulkinghorn, sir, I must stipulate that if you have any word with me, that word is spoken in the presence of my friend. Oh, indeed, says Mr. Tulkinghorn. Yes, sir, my reasons are not of a personal nature at all, but they are amply sufficient for myself. No doubt, no doubt. Mr. Tulkinghorn is as imperturbable as the hearthstone to which he has quietly walked. The matter is not of that consequence that I need to put you to the trouble of making any conditions, Mr. Guppy. He pauses here to smile, and his smile is as dull and rusty as his pantaloons. You are to be congratulated, Mr. Guppy. You are a fortunate young man, sir. Pretty well so, Mr. Tulkinghorn. I don't complain. Complain? High friends, free admission to great houses, and access to elegant ladies. Why, Mr. Guppy, there are people in London who would give their ears to be you. Mr. Guppy, looking as if he would give his own reddening and still reddening ears to be one of those people at present instead of himself, replies, Sir, if I attend to my profession and do what is right by Kenge and Carboy, my friends and acquaintances are of no consequences to them, nor to any member of the profession. Not excepting Mr. Tulkinghorn of the Fields, I am not under any obligation to explain myself further. And with all respect for you, sir, and without offence, I repeat, without offence. Oh, certainly. I don't intend to do it. Quite so, says Mr. Tulkinghorn with a calm nod. Very good. I see by these portraits that you take a strong interest in the fashionable great, sir. He addresses this to the astounded Tony, who admits the soft impeachment. A virtue in which few Englishmen are deficient, observes Mr. Tulkinghorn. He has been standing on the hearthstone with his back to the smoke chimney-piece, and now turns round with his glasses to his eyes. Who is this? Lady Dedlock. Ha! Very good likeness in its way, but it wants force of character. Good day to you, gentlemen. Good day. When he has walked out, Mr. Guppy, in a great perspiration, nerves himself to the hasty completion of taking down the Galaxy Gallery, concluding with Lady Dedlock. Tony, he says hurriedly, and to his astonished companion, let us be quick in putting the things together and getting out of this place. It were in vain longer to conceal from you, Tony, that between myself and one of the members of a swan-like aristocracy whom I now hold in my hand, there has been an undivulged communication and association. The time might have been when I might have revealed it to you. It never will be more. Due alike to the oath, I have taken alike to the shattered idol, and alike to the circumstance over which I have no control, that the whole should be buried in oblivion. I charge you as a friend by the interest you have ever testified in the fashionable intelligence, and by little advances with which I may have been able to accommodate you, so to bury it without a word of inquiry. The charge Mr. Guppy delivers in a state little short of forensic lunacy, while his friend shows a dazed mind in his whole head of hair, and even in his cultivated whiskers.